High above the skies of Europe in the 1940s, the thunder of engines often meant life or death. Hundreds of aircraft, silhouetted against the clouds, painted the heavens with contrails that stretched for miles. To those watching from below, it was the sound of war itself, deep, rumbling, relentless. For the men who strapped themselves into those bombers, it was the sound of uncertainty. Every flight could be their last. And yet, amid the countless stories of bravery and tragedy in World War II, one tale would leave even hardened veterans speechless. The day two giant American B-17 flying fortresses flew locked together, piggyback, across enemy skies. To truly understand the shock of that moment, we must step back into the world of the bomber crews, the missions they flew, and the deadly dance they carried out over Europe. The Boeing B-17, known as the Flying Fortress, was a marvel of engineering for its time. With 4 roaring engines, heavy armor plating, and multiple gun positions bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, it was designed to take punishment and keep flying. But even the most resilient fortress was never invincible. When waves of German fighters came slicing through the skies, or when black puffs of flak burst all around, the odds of returning home grew slimmer by the second. For the men aboard, life was measured not in days, but in missions. 25 successful sorties were the golden number, the promise of going home. But so few ever made it that far. The loss rates were staggering. A man might look around at the faces of his crew one morning, laughing, joking, trying to hide their nerves, and by evening, half of them could be gone. Each mission was a roll of the dice, and the dice were often cruel. The German Luftwaffe, seasoned and deadly, understood the importance of stopping those bombers. The factories, the railways, the fuel depots of Germany, all were within the sights of the flying fortresses. To defend their homeland, the Germans hurled everything they had into the skies. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, relentless anti-aircraft fire. And for every bomber formation heading into the Reich, danger was certain. It was in this crucible of steel, fire, and smoke that one of the most extraordinary incidents in aviation history unfolded. Crews who witnessed it swore they would never forget. A story so bizarre, so unbelievable, that it sounded like a myth. 2 bombers, mangled by enemy fire, colliding in the chaos of combat. And then, instead of spiraling to their deaths, somehow remaining locked together, flying as one, with men trapped inside both. But before that incredible day, we must first understand the machine itself, the Flying Fortress, and the men who gave it life. The B-17 was not just a bomber. It was a symbol. Its massive wingspan stretched nearly 104 feet. Fully loaded, it weighed over 60,000 pounds. It could carry thousands of pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory, flying at altitudes that often reached 25,000 feet, where the cold was so intense that bare skin could freeze in seconds. At those heights, oxygen masks were a necessity. Fingers went numb inside thick gloves, lips cracked under frozen air, and frostbite was always lurking. Yet through it all, the crews pressed forward mission after mission, determined to cripple the Nazi war machine. Inside the bomber, life was a balance between routine and sheer terror. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled with the controls, keeping formation with dozens of other fortresses around them. The navigator charted their course across hostile skies. The bombardier, lying prone in the nose, waited for the moment to release destruction onto factories and airfields below. And scattered throughout the fuselage were the gunners, eyes scanning the skies for enemy fighters that could strike from any angle. The tail gunner, crouched alone in his small bubble at the back, often saw death coming before anyone else. The camaraderie of the crews was legendary. 10 men, locked inside their flying fortress, trusted each other with their lives. They ate together, trained together, flew together, and sometimes died together. If one man faltered, all were at risk. If one man held his nerve, all had a chance. It was this bond, forged in fire, that gave them the strength to climb aboard again and again, despite the horrors they had already seen. And yet, as unbreakable as these men seemed, they were still human. Fear gnawed at them before every takeoff. Superstition spread to the ranks, lucky charms, prayers, routines that had to be followed to ward off fate. Letters home were written with shaking hands, sometimes never mailed. To fly was to gamble with destiny. The Germans, too, had their own perspective. To them, the endless waves of bombers blotting out the sky felt unstoppable. Civilians huddled in bunkers as the ground shook from the thunder of high explosives. Fighter pilots scrambled into their cockpits, engines screaming as they clawed upward to meet the formations. For every German flyer, the sight of the flying fortress was both a challenge and a nightmare. They knew how tough these bombers were. They could pour bullets into a fortress, watch pieces of metal tear away, engines trail smoke, yet still see it lumbering onward, refusing to fall. And so, in this deadly duel between German determination and American resilience, moments of shocking spectacle were inevitable, but none compared to the piggyback bombers. Even to seasoned Luftwaffe pilots who had seen everything, this was different, a sight so surreal it burned itself into memory. The legend begins in the bitter skies over Europe, during yet another mission where hundreds of B-17s droned toward their targets. German fighters swarmed, cannon shells tearing into wings and fuselages. Flak erupted all around. In that chaos, two fortresses became entangled, locked together in a way no one could have imagined possible. And somehow, against all odds, they continued to fly. To the Germans watching from below, it was as though the sky itself had conjured a cruel trick. To the Americans, it was a nightmare come alive, men trapped in two broken machines that had fused into one. And as the world would soon learn, the story of those piggyback bombers would become one of the most haunting and extraordinary tales of the entire air war. The mission began like countless others. Dawn broke over the airfield of England, casting pale light across long runways with a B-17 crews prepared for yet another perilous journey. The ground crews swarmed, loading bombs, checking engines, securing ammunition belts into machine guns. The crews themselves moved quietly, each man lost in his own thoughts. They had done this before, but the fear never left. They climbed aboard their bombers, strapping themselves into seats that had become both workplace and potential coffin. Soon, the engines roared to life, the sound rolling across the countryside like thunder. That morning, the target lay deep inside Germany, a factory complex vital to the Nazi war effort. The enemy would not let them pass unchallenged. The men knew this. Every mile eastward would bring heavier resistance. Yet the formations rose anyway, hundreds of bombers stretching into the sky, wingtip to wingtip, a steel armada bound for hostile airspace. Among them were two bombers that would soon be etched into history. One belonged to the 100th Bomb Group, often called the Bloody 100 because of its terrifying casualty rates. The other, a sister ship from a neighboring squadron. At takeoff, they were just two of many, indistinguishable in the vast sea of fortresses. Hours later, they would become legends. As the formation crossed the channel and pressed inland, the Germans were waiting. The first signs came as dark specks on the horizon, growing rapidly until they resolved into fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, diving with lethal precision. Machine guns chattered, cannon spat fire, and suddenly the sky erupted. Tracers streaked past the bombers, ripping into wings and fuselages. Bombers lurched as explosions from flak shells blossomed around them. The two fortresses in question soon found themselves under direct assault. Enemy fighters swarmed them, hammering them with bullets and cannon shells. One bomber took heavy damage, its controls failing, engine sputtering. The other, maneuvering to avoid fire, drifted too close. In the chaos of combat, the inevitable happened. The two massive aircraft collided. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screamed as fuselages crunched together, wings sheared, and fragments scattered into the void. Yet in a twist of fate, instead of tearing each other apart and spiraling downward, the two aircraft locked together. One fortress lodged atop the other, their structures fused by the violence of the crash. The bottom plane lost its crew instantly as the collision crushed the cockpit. The top bomber remained partially intact, its crew stunned by the unimaginable reality. They were now riding piggyback atop another flying fortress, both machines groaning under the strain, still somehow airborne. Eyewitnesses later described the scene with disbelief. German pilots circled the bizarre spectacle, holding fire for a moment out of sheer astonishment. Their drifting across the sky, were two enormous bombers locked together like some monstrous hybrid. The bottom plane, powerless, dangled dead weight. The top plane, engines still functioning, dragged them both through the air. And inside that surviving fortress, men were still alive, for the Americans trapped in the upper bomber. The situation was nightmarish. They knew their plane had been crippled. They could feel the weight of the second bomber pulling them down. The controls fought every input, straining against the impossible burden. But somehow, the top fortress kept flying. It was a grotesque miracle. On the ground below, German civilians stared upward in disbelief. Farmers paused in their fields. Soldiers halted their marches. Children pointed skyward at the impossible sight. For many, it was as though they were witnessing a ghostly vision, something out of a fever dream. A few Luftwaffe pilots later admitted they could hardly bring themselves to fire on such a spectacle. It seemed like fate had already dealt the bombers their cruelest blow. Yet fire they did. German fighters circled back, pouring bursts of machine gun fire into the crippled pair. Holes blossomed across the fuselage. Flames licked at the wings. Still, the strange twin-bodied fortress lumbered onward, refusing to fall. And here lies one of the strangest facts of the incident. The upper bomber's crew was still alive long enough to attempt escape. Some parachutes were seen blossoming against the cold blue sky, but others never made it out, whether trapped by damage, disoriented by shock, or unwilling to abandon their ship. Several men remained inside until the bitter end. As the monstrous hybrid drifted deeper into German territory, the inevitable finally came, with controls barely holding, engines failing one by one. The piggyback bombers began to lose altitude. Witnesses reported the strange craft descending almost gracefully, as though reluctant to give in to gravity. Then, with a thunderous crash, the pair slammed into the earth. Fire consumed the wreckage. For miles around, people spoke of the terrible sight. The two flying fortresses locked in death's embrace. The Germans were stunned. To them, the flying fortress had always seemed indestructible, but this was something else entirely. The image of those two bombers, fused in midair, became the talk of the countryside. Luftwaffe reports later noted the incident with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Even hardened fighter aces confessed they had never seen anything like it before or since. In the aftermath, the tale spread rapidly. Survivors from other bomber crews who had seen the collision recounted it in hushed tones, as if unsure whether they had truly witnessed reality. Some swore the upper bomber had remained aloft for nearly half an hour after the collision. Others claimed they had seen men desperately trying to climb from one bomber into the other, though such stories may have been colored by imagination. What mattered was a lasting impression. A moment that defied logic, burned into memory like a nightmare from the sky. Historians later pieced together fragments of the story, reconstructing events from German eyewitness accounts, Luftwaffe reports, and testimony from surviving American airmen. While details sometimes conflicted, the central fact remained undeniable. On that day, in the chaos of battle, two B-17 flying fortresses collided and flew locked together long enough to become a legend. And as strange as it seems, this was not the only time bizarre mid-air collisions occurred during the war. Countless stories emerged of bombers losing wings yet continuing to fly, of pilots bailing out only to see their abandoned plane glide on without them, of crippled aircraft bringing their crews home against all odds. The B-17, in particular, seemed to have a spirit of its own. Its reputation for resilience was unmatched. Crews called it the plane that wanted to live. And nowhere was that more evident than in the spectacle of the piggyback bombers. For the Germans, it became a symbol of American determination, a machine so stubborn it would keep flying even when broken in half. For the Americans, it was a sobering reminder of how fragile life in the skies could be, and how quickly chaos could turn order into disaster. The story spread through both sides of the war like wildfire, fueling legends that would endure long after the guns fell silent. Even today, aviation historians marvel at the event. Photographs of the piggyback bombers, yes, there were a few taken by German witnesses, remain some of the most haunting images of the air war. They capture not just the bizarre mechanics of the accident, but the sheer will of men and machines caught in the madness of battle. And yet, As shocking as the story is, it still leaves one haunting question unanswered. What must have felt like for the men trapped inside, knowing they were flying on borrowed time, held aloft by a miracle that could not last? As the strange, fused pair of B-17 staggered across the German sky, the climax of their tragic journey approached. For those inside the upper bomber, time seemed suspended, stretched into unbearable moments where every sound, every vibration, felt like it could be the last. The groan of metal, the roar of engines straining against impossible weight, the shudder of the airframe with each gust of wind. It all combined into a grim symphony of survival. Imagine the confusion inside that cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot, struggling with controls that no longer obeyed. Instruments flickered, dials spun wildly, as though mocking the crew's desperation. Oxygen masks hissed with each breath, amplifying the sound of panic. Behind them, the gunners and other crew members clung to whatever they could, eyes wide, faces pale, trying to process the unthinkable truth. Their bomber would fly with another bomber welded into its belly. No manual had prepared them for this. No training drill had ever suggested a solution. All they could do was fight. Fight to keep altitude, fight to steer, fight to survive. The crew knew their odds were slim, but still they held on. That was the spirit of the bomberman. When every rational instinct screamed to surrender, they refused. Below, the Germans continued to watch in awe. Civilians pointed at the spectacle as it lumbered overhead. Farmers abandoned plows. Soldiers stopped marching. School children ran into the streets. Some crossed themselves, convinced they were witnessing an omen. To the Luftwaffe pilots circling nearby, the sight was grotesque yet mesmerizing. Two fortresses locked in a deathly embrace, still refusing to fall. Even hardened aces admitted later that they were reluctant to fire. The scene carried its own dreadful poetry, as though fate itself had claimed these machines. But fate could not hold them aloft forever. The top bomber's engines were sputtering, coughing black smoke, their fuel lines likely damaged in collision. One by one, they began to fail. The airspeed dropped. The ground rose closer. The controls grew heavier. The pilot wrestled, hands numb, eyes bloodshot, refusing to let go even as gravity claimed him. And then came the final descent. Witnesses described it as strangely graceful, almost serene after the chaos of combat. The twin-bodied fortress drifted downward like a wounded bird, wings trembling, nose dipping. Some of the crew managed to escape, parachutes opening against the sky like fragile white flowers. Others never left the wreckage. Perhaps they were trapped. Perhaps they refused to abandon their brothers. Perhaps they simply held on to the controls until the very last heartbeat. The impact was violent. The ground erupted as the two bombers slammed into fields near the German countryside. Fire blossomed instantly, devouring twisted metal. Black smoke coiled into the heavens, marking the end of one of the strangest flights of the entire war. For miles around, people spoke of the crash. Even days later, civilians visited the site, staring at the tangled ruins of what had once been two mighty flying fortresses. Children whispered about the men who had been inside. Soldiers shook their heads, muttering that they had seen everything now. For the survivors, those who floated down beneath silk canopies, the ordeal was not yet over. Captured by German troops, they were marched away as prisoners of war. Behind them, the wreck still burned, a funeral pyre for comrades who would never return. The surviving men were haunted by the memory forever, the sensation of their bomber colliding, the surreal realization that they were flying atop another, the terrible descent that ended with screams and fire. When news of the incident spread among American bomber groups, disbelief was the first reaction. Men swapped stories in barracks and mess halls, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Two B-17s locked together in flight, one carrying the other all the way across Germany. Half the crew jumped, the rest went down. The tale became legend almost instantly. Some refused to believe it until photographs and German eyewitness accounts confirmed the impossible truth. Historians have since debated the details. How long did the two bombers actually remain aloft? Was it minutes or nearly half an hour? Exactly how many crewmen escaped? And from which bomber? The fog of war, the chaos of combat, ensures that the full truth may never be known. But one fact is certain: the event was real. The photographs exist. The testimonies align. Two flying fortresses collided, fused, and continued to fly. Something no engineer could have predicted, no tactician could have planned. And so, the story has endured. It has become one of those rare wartime legends that transcends technical detail, speaking instead to the resilience of both man and machine. The B-17 was already known as a flying fortress, a bomber that could come home with gaping holes, shredded wings, engines gone silent. But the piggyback bombers took that reputation to another level. Even in death, they refused to let go. In the years after the war, veterans spoke of it with reverence. Pilots, gunners, and ground crew alike described it as one of the most haunting things they had ever heard. It was retold in books, documentaries, and classrooms, often with a mix of awe and sorrow, not because it was merely strange, but because it symbolized the brutal unpredictability of war. In a sky filled with thousands of planes, each mission offering countless dangers, sometimes fate created moments too bizarre for fiction. The photographs of the piggyback bombers remain among the most striking images of World War II aviation. They capture a moment frozen in time, metal torn, engines roaring, two planes impossibly fused in flight. To look at them is to feel both horror and wonder. Horror at the cost, at the men who died inside. Wonder at the resilience, at the sheer defiance of gravity and logic. But beyond the spectacle lies a deeper truth. War was filled with moments like this, moments where human beings were pushed to their limits, where machines carried their crews further than anyone thought possible. The story of the piggyback bombers is not just about steel and fire. It is about men, young men, far from home, who face the unthinkable with courage. Men who climbed aboard those fortresses, knowing each flight could be their last, yet flew anyway. And in that sense, the legend of the piggyback B-17s is more than just an oddity. It is a symbol of sacrifice, of determination, and of the strange, terrible beauty of history. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit, and sometimes even the machines we create, can surprise us with defiance. So when we remember the piggyback bombers, we are not just recalling a bizarre accident. We are honoring the men who lived and died inside them. We are honoring the thousands who flew the skies of Europe, who braved the flak and the fighters